Good evening, everyone. My name is Nancy Sinkoff. I'm the academic director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life, professor of Jewish Studies and History here at Rutgers University. I am so happy to welcome you. I want you to know that we have over 400 people on this webinar, the first of our spring 2021 semester. What an auspicious way to begin our public programming here at the Bildner Center. Let me give you the ground rules, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with because we're all now Zoom experts, but let me just go over them again. This is a webinar format. All of the attendees, the public, are muted. If you want to ask a question during the lecture that will pose at the end of the lecture, please put your question in the chat. And I want to ask you to use the chat for questions, not for comments, because we won't have that kind of time to have discursive comments. So please put your questions in the chat. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Bildner Center website probably in a day or two, so it can process. So before I introduce our speaker, Professor Kirsten Fermaglich, I want to say a few words about the topic of name changing. Now, many of you know that name changing, or having two names, which allows people to use their names in different settings, is as old as the hills, and so are its mythologies. You may recall that the biblical figure of Joseph has his name changed. A Hebrew slave, he successfully enters the upper echelons of Egyptian society and is transformed materially there. His social status, his clothing, his jewelry, and of course his power. And he's culturally transformed as well. And in chapter 41, verse 45 of the book of Exodus, we're told that the Pharaoh called Joseph the name Tafnach Paneach. So in the Israelite imagination, there's a name changing that goes on, and it has meanings in terms of acculturation and power and identity, the topic of today's talk. In the early 19th century, an East European enlightened Jew noticed what was going on to the West in Berlin, and he wrote about it in an unpublished manuscript, criticizing the behavior of his German Jewish brethren. Quote, "They were ashamed of their origin, ashamed of their brethren, and finally ashamed of their Jewish names. Hirsch was transformed into Hermann and into Heinrich, Malka into Amalia, and then into Mai Blume." So, unquote. And that's a criticism of name changing. And more recently, the great Jewish literary son of Newark, New Jersey, who is close to our hearts, Philip Roth, has his narrator in his magisterial novel, American Pastoral, tell us about the character Swede. Quote, "Conflicting Jewish desires were awakened by the sight of him. The contradiction in Jews who want to fit in and want to stand out resolved itself in the triumphant spectacle of this Swede, who was actually only another of our neighborhood Seymours, whose forebears have been Solomons and Shauls, and who would themselves beget Stevens, who would in turn beget Shawns," unquote. So these three very diverse historical sources give you a sense of the complexity of this phenomenon called Jewish name changing. And tonight's lecture will focus on this phenomenon in the US context, in the American context. And I cannot think of a more perfect person to do this. I've known Professor Kirsten Fermaglich for a long time. I've admired her work, and I'm so looking forward to hearing her speak about her marvelous book tonight. Formally, let me tell you who she is. Kirsten Fermaglich is professor of history and Jewish studies at Michigan State University. She is the author of the book, A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, NYU Press, which won the Saul Wiener Prize for the best book in American Jewish history from the American Jewish Historical Society in 2019. She is also author of a book entitled American Dreams and Nazi Nightmares, Early Holocaust Consciousness and Liberal America, 1957 to 1965, which was published by Brandeis University Press in 2006. With Lisa Fine, she edited the Norton Critical Edition of Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique. And she's currently co-editor of the very important academic journal of the American Jewish Historical Society, which is called American Jewish History, with our colleagues Daniel Sawyer and Adam Mendelson. Tonight's lecture is entitled A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, Name Changing in the 20th Century. Please welcome from afar, virtually, but with great anticipation, Professor Kirsten Fermaglich. Thank you. You're muted, Kirsten. You're still muted. You can't change it? Okay, one sec. We will figure this out.
Did that work? Okay, great, terrific.
Okay, we'll do this again. Let's welcome with great anticipation and enthusiasm and virtually with all of the obstacles that this Zoom environment creates for us. Here is Professor Kirsten Fermaglich. Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm going to take, thank you very much. I would thank you so much to Nancy for such a lovely introduction. I have known Nancy for such a long time, and I am so grateful to her for inviting me to give this talk. It's a real honor. Yeah, it's a real honor to speak for the Bildner Center and a real honor to speak for her, whose work I also have admired for a long time. So thank you so much. Thank you so much to Karen Small and to Hannah Feldman for helping with all of the details, and Sarah Badillo for helping with all the details and allowing me to both be seen and heard. I really appreciate it. And finally, thank you to so many people for showing up. I've never spoken to so many people before, so thank you all for coming, especially during these kinds of crazy days, and being willing to spend an hour listening to the subject. I'm really thrilled, and a shout out to the few people who contacted me before, family and old friends from New Jersey who are contacting me to be here. I really appreciate it. So if we were in person, I would start off my talk by sort of asking, how many people have a name-changing story in their family, among their friends, how many people, among neighbors, acquaintances, how many people have seen a show, a movie or a play, or read a book that has name-changing as a theme or a character who's changed their names. Usually by the time I'm done with this, pretty much everybody in the audience has their hand up. Name changing is a really integral part of American Jewish culture and actually just American culture more broadly. Anecdotes and jokes and folklore about name changing kind of abounds in our lives. And I think that those images have really shaped our cultural understanding of what name changing is. So I'm going to share my screen with you right now. There we go. What I want to do is show you some images and sort of talk about three kind of prominent images of name changing that I think really shape the way that we have seen it. And frankly, shaped the way I saw it before I walked into the archives. So the first image is of Edward G. Robinson's memoir, or it comes from, the first image is of Edward G. Robinson, and the story about name changing comes from his memoir, All My Yesterdays. An immigrant from Bucharest, Romania, Robinson changed his name from Emanuel Goldenberg as an 18-year-old drama student when, quote, he said, "It was suggested to me ever so tactfully that Emanuel Goldenberg was not a name for an actor. Too long, too foreign, and I suspect too Jewish." Although he says, quote, "The thought of changing it was unpleasant, somehow a denial of my beginning, somehow unfaithful to my mother and father and 5 brothers." He says he searched for a new American sounding name and adopted his middle initial G as, quote, "my private treaty with the past." So that's one story. The second story is actually a pretty common joke. And again, if we were in person together, you would finish the joke for me. So here it is. A Jewish immigrant entered Ellis Island and was processed according to the standard procedures. These were very confusing to him. He was overwhelmed by the bustle and the noise. And so when one of the officials asks him, "What is your name?" he replies, "Schein vergessen." In Yiddish, "I've already forgotten." And so the official then recorded his name as Sean Ferguson or Shane Ferguson, depending on how you know the joke. And yes, when I tell this in person, people both laugh, but also they wind up saying it with me. And then the third story is actually a scene or several scenes from a popular film, Hester Street, which many of you may have seen. It's a dramatization of the Abraham Kahn novel Jekyll. Jekyll is an immigrant who's been in the country for several years and has tried to shed his old world life completely, calling himself Jake. He prides himself on his Yankee clothes and his knowledge of American culture and English language. But when his father dies, he sends for his wife and his son, who are confused and surprised by his name change. He is embarrassed by their greenhorn status, and he ultimately shuns his wife, played here by Carol Kane, for a beautiful, more assimilated woman. But that name change plays a crucial role in the film, as his wife is confused and rejected and ashamed by the way that he treats her, and by this name change that seems to symbolize the gulf between the two of them. So I don't know if you know these three specific stories, but I would imagine that at least one or two of them probably sound familiar. Certainly movie star name changes have got to ring a bell, right? And although all of these stories are substantially different, I want to point out that they share one crucial similarity. They all emphasize name changing as a profoundly individual activity. In the case of Edward G. Robinson and all stories of movie star name changes, the name change is the act of an extraordinary individual, right, who's distinguished by talent or beauty or charisma and sort of moves out of the Jewish community into kind of the pantheon of stars by virtue of those talents. On the other hand, immigrant Sean Ferguson's name change was the result of profound isolation. Right? His name is changed because he's a lonely individual with no understanding of or connections to his new culture, and because he has no one to aid him in navigating the system. And then finally, in Hester Street, name changing is identified with a shallow young man who wants to abandon his family and his roots and to remake himself entirely in the new world. It's a symbol of this kind of betrayal of his home and his roots. All three of these stories suggest that name changing was an act that was entered into by individuals, isolated or escaping from or betraying Jewish families and the Jewish community. And in contrast with these three popular stories of individual name changers, which, as I would say, I think they've really shaped the way we all see name changing, I would actually like to offer you another, frankly, more common and more realistic story of name changing in America. In 1932, a man named Max Greenberger petitioned the city court of the city of New York to allow himself, as well as two of his 4 children, to change their last name to Green. One of Greenberger's grounds for the petition was that the name Greenberger is a foreign-sounding name and is not conducive to securing good employment as a musician. The chosen profession of his daughter. Another ground was that the name Greenberger is not helpful towards securing an appointment as an intern in a hospital. That was the chosen profession of one of his sons. Greenberger's petition was one of thousands submitted in the middle of the 20th century to the New York City City Court. Men, women, and children like the Greenbergers legally changed their ethnic sounding names to less ethnically identifiable ones between 1930 and 1960 in huge numbers. And until the 1980s, Jewish names were represented disproportionately among the names being changed legally in New York City. Yet before I did my research, historians had not seriously studied the significance of name changing in American or American Jewish life. Scholars of American life have tended to take name changing for granted, to refer to its existence casually. My book, and I have it right here, my book is actually the first historical book on name changing in the United States. And I think that's a problem. I mean, I'm glad I was able to do it, but I think it's a problem because by exploring the actual practice of name changing in more depth, as my book does, we can understand much more about the lives of American Jews. The fact that Max Greenberger was not a young single man seeking to escape his Jewish past and succeed in an elite non-Jewish world, nor was he a hapless immigrant caught up in circumstances, but instead a middle-aged father, right, seeking to improve his family's economic status. I think all of this illustrates for us the degree to which name changing was a voluntary group activity entered into by thousands of Jewish men, women, and children. In the middle of the 20th century in New York City, name changing was a strategy of class mobility that Jewish families entered into in large numbers. It allowed Jewish families to attain and to strengthen their position in the American middle class. But that position came with communal disapproval and psychological cost. So before I get started, that's kind of the basic outline to kind of get you hooked. I want to talk a little bit about my research and then sort of give you some outlines for what the talk is going to look like. So in my research, I primarily examined the name change petitions filed with the City Court of New York City from 1887 through 2012, so over a century of name changes. And I'm happy to talk more during Q&A about my research in these archives as well as my methodology. I have fun stories, and it was a really kind of interesting way to do the research. It's important to note that I did look at other sources, including the archives of Jewish organizations like the National Jewish Welfare Board and the American Jewish Congress. But the bulk of my findings about name changing were in New York City itself. And when I speak, actually speaking to a New Jersey audience, that might not seem so strange for you, but when I speak in Michigan or when I speak anywhere else in the country, they want to know why New York City. And so I want to give a little bit of information about that, and I can certainly talk a little bit more about it during Q&A if anybody's interested. Part of the reason I chose to write about New York City was simply about the access to the records. Most of these records they're held in courts, city courts. There's still materials that are being used by the courts, and they're not usually made accessible to researchers in the way that I did. So Detroit, for example, wouldn't allow me to look at their materials. So that's one reason I chose New York City, was because of its accessibility in a way that other places were not. But I also need to admit that as people here know, or might have guessed, and as I've already mentioned, I have friends and family here from New Jersey. I am from New Jersey. I'm from the New York area. And when I began doing this research, it was in 2007. I had a 2-year-old son. And I did not want to leave him for the long periods of time that it took me to do this research. Looking through over 100 years of material took me over 12 years. And I didn't want to leave him alone because of the help of my mother-in-law, who's actually watching tonight, and my father-in-law. I was able to stay at their house, also my mother's house in New Jersey, and be able to commute for my research. To give you a sense of how long this research takes, this is a picture of my children now. They've grown just a little bit. I wound up having a daughter along the way. She came with me too. So there's a lot of personal reasons that went into looking at New York, as well as practical reasons. But I'm also happy to talk about sort of what placing New York in the context of the larger country. If anybody wants to ask that question during the Q&A, it's a good thing to talk about. And so that is just to sort of get out the basic materials that I looked at. I also, before I start to do this research, I do want to make sort of a basic caveat. It's important to note that I'm looking at formal legal name changing. It is, I'm looking at the petitions that people filed in city court to change their names. That is a voluntary activity that differs greatly from many people's understandings of name changing. Many people, frequently when I give talks, many people believe that their families' names were changed at Ellis Island when their ancestors entered the country. This is a common story among many American families in general and American Jewish families in particular. Despite this belief, most genealogists and immigration historians argue that this kind of mass involuntary name changing simply did not take place. And you can actually sort of see this through some of the records, some of the art materials that I actually can show you on the screen. So if you look at this picture that I sort of flashed before to illustrate Sean Ferguson, you can see that the Ellis Island officials there are looking at these, books. These are the ship manifests that people, that the ships had that registered all of their passengers. If you've done any genealogical work, you've probably seen these if you've gone onto ancestry.com, which is where this material comes from. Here's just a random passenger list. This is the manifest. This is what those officials are looking at. And if you look, you can see that all of the names are written on the left-hand side, and they have little check marks next to them. You might be hard to see too clearly here. They would not ask people. They were not sitting and writing down and answering questions. They took these ship manifests, and then you can see they made little check marks against, right? So they would call up your name. They would have your name already written, and they would check you off. So there really was no space or documents for people to be changing their name. They're actually just checking names off of a manifest. Also, Ellis Island, immigrants did not leave Ellis Island with any paperwork that bound them to any new name. And in fact, American law actually gave no power at all to inspectors to determine individuals' names. And in fact, Ellis Island rules specifically, said you cannot, tamper with people's names at all. So it's certainly possible that maybe a few rogue inspectors might have recommended to immigrants that they change their names. That's a Polish name, get rid of that name. And it's even possible that maybe somebody wrote a different name on an immigrant's tag when they were detained, which did not always happen, and that immigrants might have misunderstood these activities as like permanent acts of US government officials. But this would be very small instances. There's really no evidence of mass involuntary name changing at Ellis Island. And instead what there is a lot of evidence of voluntary name changing on the part of both immigrants on naturalization petitions, which I personally did not look at, but is another really great place for people to go to look at the voluntary nature of name changing. And then also city court petitions, mostly for American-born, for native-born Americans who could change their names in court. And that's what I decided to look at for this work. So I'm happy to talk more about this in Q&A. Sometimes people come in with a story from their family of a name change at Ellis Island. And so I know this can be sometimes difficult, but for me, it was really important to look at actually where the evidence was. And it was both in naturalization petitions, but also in these court petitions. And I'm happy to talk more about this at the end if you'd like. So before I get started, I just want to sort of offer you an outline of the book to sort of give you a sense, and that will be an outline of the talk as well. So initially I wanted the subtitle for my book to be The Rise, the Politics, and the Fall of Jewish Name Changing in the 20th Century. The press did not like this. I don't know why. So it has the subtitle that it has, but this is kind of the structure. So as I talk tonight, and you don't have to take notes, but the talk will sort of first go through the rise of name changing from 1917 to 1945. Really what I see is kind of, a growth and then really a mass explosion of name changing in the sort of the first half of the 20th century and really in the middle of the 20th century. And then I'm going to tell a little bit about the politics of name changing, particularly within the Jewish community from 1945 to 1967 in the immediate post-war years. And then I'm going to talk about the fall from 1967 to 2012. I may not get that far actually, but I'll sort of talk about sort of the ways that name changing kind of ends as a phenomenon for Jews in New York City. So first, the rise of name changing. So during the years between World War I and World War II, New Yorkers began to file name change petitions in numbers that were double triple, and quadruple those before the wars. It's fairly astounding actually when you look at it. This official name changing was really a byproduct of the growth of the modern state in the 20th century. You know, it's very significant that there are two world wars that are kind of bracketing this moment. If you look at the beginning of the 20th century, immigrant memoirs are filled with stories of unofficial name changing. So immigrants just choose new names, right? Quickly, you know, they get rid of their old name, they take on a new name. You know, they're at the sweatshop, they're in their neighborhood, they say, oh, you know, I'm kind of tired of this name, or this name doesn't look good in America. And, you know, one of their coworkers says, oh, you should be Ruth instead of Rose. And they say, okay. So they change their names quickly without a second thought, and they do not have to go to court to change it. They do not have to file any official paperwork. As a growing government bureaucracy began to track individuals who needed to pay taxes, serve in the military, work at a defense plant, receive welfare benefits, names came to take on much more social, political, and economic significance. Ordinary individuals found it increasingly necessary to change their names in order to receive benefits and to avoid penalties. And so it's not surprising that these years between 1917 and 1945, two wars and the growth of the welfare state with the New Deal witnessed a huge boom in name changing. And then that's when New Yorkers begin to change their names. But it's also worth noting, even though my petitions include petitions from all kinds of New Yorkers, not just Jews by any means, but Jews were overwhelmingly and disproportionately represented in the petitions, far out of proportion to their actual numbers in the city. During these years, Jews were roughly about 50% of the pool of petitioners to change their names. But the Jewish population in New York City during these years was at its highest, roughly 25 to 30%. And if you account for the fact that most of these petitions, the vast majority of them are coming from Manhattan, there, the Jewish population was only between 14 and 17% at this time. So Jews are really overwhelmingly represented, and no other ethnic group came close to Jews' numbers in these kinds of petitions. For example, you know, I can say in 1942, this is just an example, the total number of petitions that were submitted by people with Slavic, German, Italian, and Greek surnames all together, all of those four groups all together equaled about 1/2 of the Jewish petitions submitted to change names for reasons of ethnic mobility. So it's a really kind of astounding disproportionality. Excuse me. And I'm going to talk about why I think that is in a second, and why I think it really tells us a lot about Jewish history. The other thing that I think is really significant for us to think about is kind of what I've already mentioned in the opening, that large numbers of the petitions were filed jointly by family members, like the Greenbergers, parents filing for underage children, sometimes spouses filing with one another, adult siblings filing with one another, sometimes entire family units with adult parents, minor children, everyone filing all together. Women regularly engaged in name changing with their husbands, brothers, and fathers. So in contrast to the images of men that we saw, you know, at the beginning of this talk, there were lots of women, and children were consistently the key subjects in name change petitions. It was not at all unusual for parents to change their children's names while keeping their own names. Many petitions emphasized that petitioners wanted to keep a store with a family name intact. Others, like Max Greenberger, expressed hopes that their children might have a better chance of finding a job or getting into school. Name changing was a family strategy. In general, all members of a family were part of one economic unit, and they filed name change petitions together to encourage the unit to thrive. And then I'm going to move on by this is kind of where I want to go for the rest of this period, and talking about the rise of Jewish name changing, is to sort of indicate that the presence of so many Jews in name change petitions, it can be explained both by upward mobility and by anti-Semitism. And so I want to explain a little bit about that. So first, let me talk about the economic strength of Jews during the first half of the 20th century. So filing an official name change petition was something that was mostly a middle class activity at this time. For one thing, it was expensive to change your name officially. It cost money to file a petition, to hire a lawyer, to place an ad in the newspaper. All these things cost money, and you had to place an ad. And because of that, because Jews had some slightly more disposable income, they would be the ethnic group more able to file these petitions. But more subtly and more significantly, in the first half of the 20th century, it was mostly middle-class people, students, white-collar workers, businessmen, who were most concerned about what their names looked like on paper. I'm just going to give you this picture of white-collar workers to indicate sort of the move of Jews into these white-collar work. Makes them the people who most need to change who most are most concerned about their names on paper. So New York state law made clear that you did not need to file legal papers in order to change your name. And that's still true today. You want to change your name to anything, go ahead and do it. So long as you're not trying to defraud people and you do it consistently for a period of time, that's your name. So the only reason you would need to change your name is if you were worried that somebody would be scrutinizing your name on paper. Working class people generally didn't file applications to get their jobs at this time. They weren't, sort of putting in anything to an HR, and they weren't applying for schools. They were getting their jobs on the basis of word of mouth. They had a friend who got them a position in the union, who got them a job at the factory, or they frankly would stand out on a street corner and allow their bodies to be inspected in order to be able to get a job as a longshoreman or a domestic servant. Right? So it is white collar workers. Businessmen's need to attract customers. Students need to get into school. Secretaries need to impress a potential employer. Jews' unusual position among immigrants, having moved in large numbers from blue collar to white collar work by the time of the Depression, made them the recent immigrant group with the most money available for filing name change petitions, but more importantly, most concerned about their name's appearance on paper. However, it's really important to note that this Jewish middle class strength, right, the fact that they have this kind of money and that they're seeking these kinds of jobs is balanced out by the fact that they are concerned about what their names look like on paper. Because Jewish names, as you saw from Max Greenberger's petition, were not conducive to securing good employment. Jews felt that they needed to change their names to succeed in the middle class because of rising and frankly rampant and institutionalized anti-Semitism that in the first part of the 20th century. As more Jews entered white-collar work, they found increasing barriers to their employment. According to one 1927 report, 89% of large New York companies declared that they preferred Christians as employees. And you can see this picture is not as great. Sometimes it shows up a little bit better, but you can see here that there are employment advertisements asking for bank tellers, floormen. You can't see it, but above they're asking for other jobs as bookkeepers, accountants from Christians and Protestants. This was perfectly legal. You can see this is the New York World, 1931. In the years before the Civil Rights Act, this was perfectly legal. And Jews, this was made quite clear to Jews that their names would make it impossible for them to work with an employment agency and would be immediately scrutinized as they looked for any jobs with any of these firms. Then too, beginning with Columbia and Harvard in the 19-teens and the 1920s, colleges and universities throughout the country began limiting the numbers of Jews that they accepted. And the way that they did this was something that will probably look familiar to you. It is an application form. The modern application form was pioneered as a form of anti-Semitism. They went from half-page application forms to 10 pages of application forms that would ask questions like, when and where was your father born? What's your father's occupation? What's your mother's maiden name in full? Right? And the purpose of this is very consciously and specifically the product of study of their student populations in determining what kinds of names were Jewish, and also the fact that Jews tended to change their names a lot. So name changing became a question that was asked about. Your mother's maiden name in full was completely a question designed to figure out who was Jewish. And then obviously to exclude them from matriculation. And then this intensifies during World War II. And again, Jewish names are kind of made into kind of a centerpiece of anti-Semitism by the 1940s during World War II, when it really spirals in the United States and worldwide, obviously. If you got onto a bus or worked in a defense plant or, were in the military, you might have seen a poem that looked like this. The first American killed in Pearl Harbor, John J. Hennessy. The first pilot to sink a Jap ship, Colin P. Kelly. First American to say, and pardon, excuse the racism that's included within this 1940s poem. First American to sink a ship with a torpedo, John P. Buckley. Greatest American air hero, Butch O'Hare. First American killed at Guadalcanal, John J. O'Brien. First American to get 4 new tires, Abraham Lipschitz. And you can see here the ways that names are used as stand-ins for ethnicity, and they are also used to target, humiliate, and cast rumor and doubt and hatred on Jews. This poem was like a ditty. It would change from, the names did not remain constant, but what remained constant was that it was a listing of heroes until the very last name, which was always somebody profiting from the war and was always somebody with an identifiably Jewish name. And all of this kind of anti-Semitism, I think that you can see in the huge numbers of name change petitions that I saw in the New York City court. Few petitioners actually talked about anti-Semitism, but they absolutely described trouble seeking work with Jewish names, and they described the ways that changing their names would bring them work. So Doris Serietsky, a stenographer and typist in 1937, testified that my name proved to be a great handicap in securing a position. She describes years of searching for jobs with this name and being unable to find anything. In order to facilitate securing work, she explains, she assumed the name Doris Watson and immediately found employment. Bertram Levy, president of the Mail Chute Corporation, explained in 1932 that his name has been a hindrance to him in his efforts to gain an entrance to various firms and to secure business from them. These people are not saying that they are experiencing anti-Semitism, although I did find a few people actually who identified as Catholic who did say they experienced anti-Semitism in their efforts to find work. But it's clear that these Jewish names limited their livelihoods and made them feel like changing, and actually made it clear to them that changing their names would allow them to find a job. So this is, you can see that this kind of context of anti-Semitism, along with Jews seeking sort of better middle-class jobs, combines together to create a situation where name changing is going to rise tremendously. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about the politics of name changing after World War II. So when this is happening in the years before World War II, there's actually not that much sort of discussion about it in the Jewish community. After World War II, there is much more conversation. And this might be surprising. There actually was a sense that, oh, name changing is something nobody would do after the war. But in fact, name changing did not end after the war. It continued at high rates. Indeed, 1946 saw the highest number of name change petitions throughout the entire 20th century, over 1,000 in 1 year. And Jewish petitions, again, represented over 50% of those petitions, far and away more than any other ethnicity. And even though name changing declined after 1948 somewhat, the numbers still remained far higher than they had been before the war. And Jews were still disproportionately represented throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, which really suggested that there are continuing fears of anti-Semitism. They don't disappear after the war, even as much as, frankly, historians have, and I think the lay people have also assumed that after 1945, anti-Semitism disappears. It really doesn't, and it certainly doesn't in the minds of these petitioners. However, after the war, name changing became surrounded by much more intense communal anxiety and debate in the Jewish community. Many Jewish leaders publicly called name changers traitors, claiming that they were passing out of the Jewish community. A discourse of self-hatred emerged in psychological literature in the 1940s, arguing that high-status Jews were frustrated by their inability to integrate with Gentiles and that they turned that frustration against themselves and others. They all popularized an image of self-hating Jews and suggested that Jews who changed their names were actually trying to pass as non-Jews and to leave the Jewish community altogether. And I'm gonna give you the points that I'm gonna make here, and then I'm gonna give you some examples. But it's worth noting that in very public, this debate is taking place in very public, not always Jewish spaces. It's taking place in sort of broad American popular culture. And within that space, name changers defend themselves. They insist that they're still Jewish and that their names made it easier to avoid prejudice in the new post-war economic and social world. So I'll just give you a few examples of this. In a 1945 book developed for the Hillel Foundation for Jewish campuses, for college campuses throughout the country, Rabbi Milton Steinberg explained that elite Jews who traveled in circles near Gentiles wanted nothing more than to cease to be Jews and to be accepted as Gentiles. When this desire became great enough, he said, Jews change their names, dissociate themselves from their fellows, calculatingly conceal their origin, and try to pass. And it's worth noting the way that, and he writes this, name changing is like a gateway to passing and leaving the Jewish community. Perhaps the most famous portrait of a Jew whose name change reflected her own self-hatred was that painted by Laura Z. Hobson in the novel and then in the film Gentleman's Agreement. If you don't know this movie, you should go see it. It's the story of a Gentile journalist, Phil Green, who goes undercover as a Jew to expose anti-Semitism. But even as he experiences all kinds of anti-Semitism, the most negative character in both the book and the film, the person who is really the most anti-Semitic, the only true anti-Semite really explored in the film, was a Jew, the Jewish secretary, Elaine Wales, who had changed her own name from Estelle Wolofsky in order to get her job at the magazine where Phil Green works. And ironically, Wales embraced the firm's discriminatory policy, fearing that any change would harm her own privileged position. Perhaps most disturbingly, she used anti-Semitic slurs to get her point across. If they get just one wrong 1 inch, it'll come out of us, she confided in Phil. Don't you hate being the fall guy for the kikey ones? Her inauthentic self-hatred was juxtaposed with the pride of Phil's friend, a Jew named Dave Goldman, who did not change his name. And was played by a Jewish actor. In the 1940s and the 1950s, name-changing loomed large in popular culture, an Oscar-winning movie like Gentleman's Agreement, as a form of self-hatred and a signpost on the way to leaving the Jewish community. However, in my petitions, in the published, unpublished correspondence that I saw, in published reports during the era, I think it's important to note that Jews who had changed their names made clear that they were not abandoning the Jewish community, and that they sought only to control their own identities in a new social and economic world, while still remaining connected to the Jewish community. So in response to one author who had criticized name changers in the elite magazine at the Atlantic Monthly, Beverly Winston, who had changed her name from Weinstein years ago, wrote years before, wrote in an unpublished letter, I don't consider my new name a camouflage or an evasion because I never pretend that I'm not Jewish, nor have I ever had the desire to do so. She explained that she viewed her new name as simply a piece of acceptable clothing, like a corset, shoulder pads, or a sincere tie. And in 1952, the Jewish Journal Commentary published a widely cited article called Name Changing and What It Gets You, in which J. Alvin Kugelmass, a journalist, interviewed 25 men and some of their wives in the New York metropolitan region. And it was clear that he thought they were looking to abandon their Jewishness, right? He says, in no sense could I sense even the remotest inkling of a wish to abandon their Jewishness, clearly signaling that's what he thought was going to happen. But instead, Kugelmass's interviewees did not seem to have passed out of the community in any significant way. It was obvious, he says, that they were seeking not so much to escape Jewishness completely as to live a dual existence in which their private lives would be Jewish, but their exterior lives would be as smooth and even as they fancy the Gentiles. Kugelmass's account illustrates for us the assumptions of the moment, right? These assumptions that these people would be abandoning their Jewishness, but also the realities of their lives. They sat there on the phone saying to him, no, I'm the president of my synagogue. I haven't left the Jewish community. They wanted to defend themselves. And you can see here this real battle in a sense that they feel embattled about their own Jewishness. So finally, and I hope I have time, Nancy, you can tell me if I'm going a little bit over and if I should cut it short a little bit. Do you want to speak up and let me know? I know I've gone a little bit over.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would say you have about 10 more minutes to do what you need to do. And we'll we'll go a little bit longer for questions, but take between 5 and 10 minutes, okay?
It won't take that long. It won't take that long. It's just a little bit. It won't take that long. Okay, so then finally, briefly, let me just address the fall of Jewish name changing during the last years of the 20th century. The success of Jewish civil rights activism in the 1960s, the astonishing upward mobility of the Jewish middle class, and a substantial Jewish migration to the suburbs led to a significant decline in name changing petitions to the New York City Civil Court by the 1970s and the 1980s. They go from, in the 1940s and 50s, they're between 55 and 60% of all name change petitions. In the 60s and 70s, they go down to half of that number. And from 1987 to 1997, there were actually no recognizable Jewish names at all in the civil court petitions that I looked at. So numbers of Jewish petitions declined significantly. But interestingly, I think, just as the practice of name changing fundamentally disappeared from the lived experiences of American Jews, it flourished in the cultural imagination of Jewish artists. Popular culture began to feature images of Jewish men who betrayed their values for a corrupt American dream. So this is not really like the self-hating Jewish name changers. It's a different portrait from Estelle Wolofsky, where they describe Estelle Wolofsky's experiences with anti-Semitism. She's a woman who kind of made this bargain. That is, by the 1970s and the 1980s, name changers are coming to symbolize kind of the corruption and the political degradation of American culture itself. Playwrights like Wendy Wasserstein, authors like Allegra Goodman, filmmakers like Barry Levinson, all use name changing to symbolize Jews' corrupt bargain with a hollow or a destructive American middle class. They also indict male name changers, and they forget entirely about the women and children who had participated so actively in name changing. And they don't talk at all about the specific details and the concrete sort of discrimination and the concrete name changing practices that were really going on in New York City Civil Court. So I use here a picture of Barry Levinson's film Avalon as an example. It's maybe the best known portrait of Jewish name changers who abandoned the warmth of their Jewish heritage for kind of a sterile consumerist suburbia. And as this Krasinski family moves from their immigrant roots in Baltimore to suburban lives in the 1960s and 1970s, two of the cousins changed their names from Krasinski to Kay and Kirk because it's, quote, it's easier to say than Krasinski. And this infuriates the patriarch, Sam, who says, who said names are supposed to be easy to say? What are you, a candy bar? You've got a name, Krasinski. This is a family. Krasinski is the name of the family. And the loss of that family name for Levinson, right, signals the loss of family, the loss of Jewishness, the loss of authenticity. In this kind of portrait, there's this kind of rampant individualism and consumerism that name changing kind of symbolizes as this gateway to a completely lost, not just the one individual who leaves the Jewish community, but the entire Jewish community, the entire Jewish family is lost and kind of corrupted and degraded by these male name changers' choices. So I'd like to, and I will say my book goes further. I actually talk about name changing today. I cut that out to make this go faster. So I'm happy to answer questions about that in Q&A too. I just want to leave you with some conclusions. Name changing is not a joke. I actually think one of the most important things about my work is in talking about this as a really serious activity that meant a lot to the Jewish community. It reflected substantial anti-Semitism in the United States as well as Jewish upward mobility. And name changing shaped the American Jewish community throughout the 20th century, even as the phenomenon also created conflict and tension within that community. Indeed, that tension was so great that the reality of name changers' experiences was forgotten for decades. So thank you for coming, my children, thank you. And I'm really happy to talk with people about any questions that you have. Thanks so much for your attention.
Okay, Kirsten, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen so that maybe also the audio will be a little bit better. We had some bubbling up.
Oh,
we had some bubbling. I think internet instability.
Yeah.
So I'm going to post some questions that come from the chat and some questions that we thought about. And I'd like to give a shout out to the audience because they asked some of the questions that I think are on a lot of people's minds.
Great.
So I want to sort of just, I know all of us as historians love to talk about how do we do our work, but I'm going to kind of leave that aside right now. Just let's get to one of the questions I think is very of our moment, which is the relationship of Jews to quote unquote whiteness and the ways in which name changing had something to do with that and with so-called passing, if it did or if it didn't. And then if you want to segue from that question also to other ethnic groups that might change their names. And I want to add to that something that I've thought about after hearing you is that can you also address this difference between the Jewish perception of how the outside world views them versus their internal negotiation with their families and their synagogues? Because it strikes me that there's a lack of a calibration there or a disconnect. So the two things, whiteness, other ethnic groups, and then inside, outside.
Okay, so actually it might be useful for me to take other ethnic groups first. So I think maybe, because I think maybe one thing to sort of make clear, I think, which is important, and I only give it a little bit of attention, the names that people are mostly changing are almost entirely Ashkenazic names. They're not Sephardic names. There are no sort of common Sephardic Jewish names that are being changed. So Sephardic Jews change their names more informally with first names, which is true for a lot of ethnic groups. So it is definitely true that there are lots of Sephardic Jews in the United States and that they too change their names. They're not doing so officially in my petitions. And I think part of the reason for that is that because there are fewer Sephardic Jews in the United States and because there's kind of an overwhelming connection between Ashkenazic Jews and Jews in general, American Jews in general, the names that are identified as Jewish are almost entirely Ashkenazic, are entirely Ashkenazic Jews. So they are white-skinned Jews from Europe. They are not Sephardic Jews. And so because of that, these Ashkenazic Jews with names like Goldstein and Greenberg and the names that you might think that they were, they are the ones being identified as having embarrassing names, Jewish names, right? Those are seen as the Jewish names. And those are the names that if they change, they can be less identified as Jewish, right? They can be invisible. A lot of times people will ask me, what names do people change to? What kinds of names do people change to? And what I say is they are anodyne names. They are names that will not be picked out of a hat, right? You can go through a lineup and nobody's going to pay attention to your name, unless it's another Jew who kind of, there's sometimes some signaling, some recognition that if you have a name that's Burke, B-E-R-K, you're probably changing your name from Berkowitz. But that is not something that the general public is aware of, right? And so they are looking to not be noticed. They're looking to be invisible. And contemporary sociologists who talk about whiteness, who talk about what it means to be white, one of the key features of it is typically the desire to be invisible. Now, of course, you're invisible to people of color if you're white, but there's a sense that, you don't get called out. You don't experience racism, right? You get to be invisible. You don't get to be made fun. You don't have to be made fun of. You don't get to be noticed as different. And that is really what people were looking for. To me, that's a little bit different from passing. And I use passing really differently in my book to talk more specifically about a fear that you are going to literally be leaving the Jewish community, that you are literally betraying them and leaving them. Most of the people that I looked at, they're using this as kind of like a 9-to-5 strategy, right? They're using this as something that they can do to get a job, to get into school. They are still members of their synagogues. They're still presidents of their synagogues, right? They're not necessarily looking to abandon the Jewish community. They are looking to kind of not be noticed and fly under the radar screen so that they can be a part of this white middle class. So that's a long answer, but I think that addresses like the first two questions that you asked. But then Nancy, would you mind asking the second part? Because I think I just touched on it, but I want to be able to address it more forthrightly.
No, I mean, I think we'd have to get into the weeds a little bit too much, but I wonder, some of the examples struck me as an historian as a teeny bit disingenuous.
Like which?
Well, you can be a member, meaning you want to be a member, your synagogue presidents want to be members of the Jewish community. When they're sort of at home, they want to be with their people, but they want to negotiate the outside world with a non-Jewish anodyne name. So I think it does bespeak certain discomforts. I wouldn't say it's self-hating, but it's not, it's a big act to change your name. It just is. So I don't know, just a little bit of, I don't know. So I think the ambivalence, I guess I didn't hear the word ambivalence in your talk. And I think there's got to be more ambivalence in these personal stories. That's all.
Yeah, absolutely. So my book concludes with a conversation, and I started, but I probably, I mean, I think that the conflict that you see in the Jewish community actually reflects some of the ambivalence, right? And I think that absolutely the families, which I address one family in particular, there is a great deal. I mean, the presidents who said, I'm still president, they also were facing a lot of criticism from other Jews for having changed their names, right? There's certainly is a tension. Absolutely. There's certainly a tension. Yeah, I don't want to get too much into the weeds. I absolutely agree with you, though, that there's an ambivalence about this, for sure. I think that there's a lot of anxiety that's being reflected in this decision to change their names, to change people's names. And I think that there is... I think that they're not necessarily leaving or betraying the community, but they're facing, these names are exposing them to, a whole host of problems that are, pretty economic. They're very practical, they're very pragmatic, as well as very psychological and personal. But absolutely, their choices wind up leading to real costs for them personally, for their families, and for the community. I mean, there's no question that this is, and that's why, to me, it's not a joke, right? Like, that's why I think it's been treated like a joke, when in fact, it really had serious impact on people, individually, familially, and on a large scale. Absolutely.
Well, Freud always thought that jokes meant that there was anxiety. So there you go. So someone, because your book is, again, as we know, again, and you're an expert, I mean, people don't understand this very much in the post-war period, which is, of course, also part of the effort to homogenize the American community because of the Cold War and the sort of cultural homogeneity. And Jews want to fit in, they want to be in the suburbs, they want to go to synagogue the way Christians go to church. So the name changing, that heightened name changing, and also they want to be disassociated from radicalism, which is associated with Eastern Europe. So it's another reason why they might name change. But what about with the rise of ethnic politics? I know you didn't touch on it in this talk, but I know it's something you think about. What about, the so-called Jewish power and Black power movements? Did you find, or did you at least, can you speculate a little about people changing their names back to be more ethnic, more Jewish, or in your face?
It's a really good question. The short answer is really no. So certainly not numerically, right? I found maybe 2 or 3 Italians changing their name back. I actually, in my petitions, I found none. When I would speak to audiences, they'd say, oh no, you have to talk to, in Michigan, there's one guy who changed his name back. So everybody wanted me to go talk to this one guy who I was never able to make an interview with. But so, you know, a little bit. And in my book, I was able to talk to a wonderful person who did change her name back. So it's not that it doesn't exist, but it is by no means kind of numerically represented, which I think actually still speaks to the way that these names are still actually, they are markers. They are things people are not eager to take on. They are things that will still mark you as Jewish. They are still things that are used as jokes, you know, as jokes that are, you know, sort of the fundamental anti-Semitism in the way that we treat names like Lowenstein and, you know, a whole host of names that still do attract ridicule, I think.
So a couple of people have asked, just because they want they want the longue durée, they want the long Jewish past, my favorite thing. They want to know how long Jews even had surnames. I don't know if you want to address that. Something that I love to talk about, but what, you know, people are curious about, you know, you talked about surnames being changed. So when did Jews get these surnames, and did they change them in Europe? Did they change them in America? You know.
Yeah, so I mean, these initial these Jewish sounding names, and you know this as well as I do. I mean, it's a product of the 19th century. It's a product of sort of the growth of modern nation states in Europe. Jews did not have last names like other groups had come to take them on much earlier ago, longer back. So Jews get them at a very distinct time, and so as they're taking them on, they take on these names that are quite distinctive, and it is under the pressure of becoming a part of these nation states, which is why they can look so distinct, and why also in Europe as well, they are subjects of ridicule, right? They're distinctive, and they kind of mark Jews off as different. Yeah, I don't know if that answers enough of the question. I don't know if there's a sort of an additional piece that
there's just, I mean, just what you said. And I think that, I mean, again, the two historians here agreeing, but I think it's important for people to understand that that you looked at a phenomenon as an historian, and therefore you are very engaged with this question of politics in the state and how Jews negotiate their belonging in this place, and in your case, the modern state of America, the United States. And in the European context, again, Jews get names, Jews get counted, censuses get done when the state needs to tax people and induct them into the army.
Yes.
And Jews are given surnames, and sometimes the surname is based on a Hebrew name, like, you know, the Simon sons, or, you know, that's Ben Simon. Sometimes they're given their names based on places where they're from. Sometimes they're given arbitrary names. The joke, again, it's a joke, is that the four most popular names of Jews from the Habsburg monarchy are Big, Little, White, Black, right? Klein, Gross, Schwartz, and Weiss. That the state gave them those names. So the phenomenon of names is a very modern state building imperial project. And so, and your work really focuses on the American context. And as what you didn't say is that the United States Ashkenazic diaspora was the largest one in the world. And you had a demographic weight of New York Jews feeling the pressures, as you said, of social anti-Semitism, of residential restriction, of quotas. We had an undergraduate who did a thesis on quotas at Rutgers when it was private, semi-private, public back in the day.
Very interesting. I wouldn't have known about them at Rutgers. That's very
Semi-private. Well, Rutgers has a very long and interesting storied history as a university because it was private and then it became public. So let's see, some other questions that people wanted to ask. I'm going to go back to the chat. Hold on a second. People want to be in touch with you about their personal stories, Kirsten. So we'll make sure you get a transcript so you can be in touch with them.
I love getting all personal stories. So please feel free to send them to me. I do love that.
Someone wanted to know, and two people related to this. The title of your book was A Rosenberg by Any Other Name. So people wanted to know, you didn't get your first choice. Why did you choose that? And then one person wanted to know if it had specific resonance with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and their conviction and then execution.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. I had, people have asked me that question. It didn't, I mean, it was just a clever name. No, actually, I will say it was the subtitle. So I was always going to do Rosenberg by any other name. The subtitle is A History of Jewish Name Changing in America. And that was what I didn't want, in part because of the New York centric element of my research. I know, Nancy, you do specific research in a place and the publisher always wants you to sort of make a larger claim for it, right? Like you do something very specific and they want you to make it broader. And so I was a little bit uncomfortable. I wanted to sort of talk about the rise and fall because that was sort of more specific and I wanted to keep it as New York. But the Rosenberg, I mean, I just chose it because it sounded like, a rose by any other name, but it is true. I certainly saw a lot of Rosenbergs changing their names, but not necessarily any of them connected to the Rosenbergs. But I did find I found an Oppenheimer family changing their name right around the time that Oppenheimer was, accused of being a Nazi spy, a Soviet spy. And there was one other sort of name that was very explicitly connected to the Cold War, and I'm not remembering what it was. I didn't see a ton. So, absolutely, I think you're right that sort of the desire not to be seen as radical. Oh, maybe it was a Moskowitz. There might have been I can't remember now. I think it might have been a Moskowitz, something that sort of had Moscow in the title, right? That sort of definitely indicated that people were nervous about being identified, with Russia. But to be honest with you, there weren't a ton like that specifically addressed that. Many more of them are just kind of, I want a job. I have this, I want to get into school. I have this new, position that I want to have respect for, things like that. But I do think that absolutely played an underlying current, but specifically, no, I wasn't necessarily making a comment about the Rosenbergs, but it's a good question.
So I have two questions again coming from the chat. Any comments about people changing their first names? We have someone on, I have to say, we have someone in the audience who mentions that he has a cousin who was getting some renown in the theater, and she was advised to change the spelling of her first name from Barbara to Barbara Streisand. So,
that's awesome.
So the question is, what about first names and what about nicknames? I don't know, maybe an Esther becoming Esty or a Hadass becoming Dasi. Do people have to formally change their first names or no?
Yes. Well, all of this, I mean, you have to change your name because of your anxieties about what people are going to see when they look at your paper, right? There's no requirement. So it's all about your own anxiety. It's all about your own, concerns. I didn't get into the modern era. I mean, certainly post 9/11. I mean, I have a whole section on the post 9/11 era in which, I mean, people now, I mean, it's certainly targeted specifically towards Muslims, actually, brown people more generally. However, anyone now who goes in has to every single possible way they might have been known. So, you literally have to say, I am known as both Linda J. Gold. I am also known as Lynn Gold. I am also known, AKA, right? Every single, possible nickname that you might have. But that's because of your anxiety that someone has said to you, gee, your name doesn't look like it looks on that other document. You need to prove it to me. During the era that I was talking about, people did change their first names, absolutely. I don't know that it was always about anxiety about how they were being examined as much, right? I think it was just that they wanted to change their last names, and while they did it, they were like, oh, I should change my first name too. Sometimes it was quite conscious. You definitely see people changing names from Sam to Stephen, right? Taking a name that's more identified with the immigrant generation and seems more Jewish, and changing it to a name that sounds more, what I don't like to say sounds more American. It bothers me. Almost 3/4 of the people who changed their names in my petitions were all American born. They're all
American born, right? That's worth, I think, emphasizing. These were not immigrants. These were American born Jews who changed their names in an American context. Right.
Absolutely, which really lets you know how strong this anti-Semitism was. And it grates on me to say that it's about finding an American name. They're all Americans, right? So what's an American name? So, but in their view, right, a name that would cause less attention to them, a name that sounded less Jewish, right? That's what they're looking for. So I absolutely did see first name changes, not as many. And I never ran the numbers, and I probably should have, because I get so many questions like this in my talks. I probably should have run the numbers, and I didn't. But it was fewer than last names, but you do see it.
Okay, so I'm going to look for one more question, and I also want to shout out to my colleagues if you have any questions you want to put in the chat. Several people noticed, and this is also first name related to first names. The joke or the mythology is that Jews of Russian origin would never name their children, their male sons, Nicholas, because of induction into the Russian army under Nicholas I from 1827 to 1855. Of course, there are a lot of Nicholases out there, but that was sort of a scandal to do that. And the other is that it was very common in the Habsburg Empire for male Jews to be named Adolf. Many people, if you look in your genealogical records, if you have family from that part of the world, and of course, after 1933, Jews who were given the name Adolf may well have changed it because of their anxiety. And someone's mentioning that Harpo Marx changed his name. I would have to check that. But other people are saying that they changed their names. But we also have the phenomenon, of hamburgers becoming Salisbury steak and Frankfurters becoming hot dogs. And that also was part of a strategy to disassociate this food with its German origins. So I think there's lots of ways. So it's 8:13. So I'm going to thank you, Kirsten, for such a lively, engaging, fabulous talk. I want to recommend to everyone that they get your book. It's at NYU Press, Rosenberg by any other name, Kirsten Fermaglich. Also read her first book, which is fantastic too, on the ways in which Holocaust consciousness seeps into American cultures in ways that you don't always expect. And I think it's part of a very important corrective to this accusation that American Jews were somehow unaware of what had happened to the fate of European Jewry, which we all know is not actually true, but has come down as a long myth. So in my capacity, not only as fellow historian, meeting in archives, which is our favorite thing to do, I want to announce to the public that the Bildner Center has lots of other programs in the spring, and I'm going to give you the highlights. Tevye's Descendants is a short history of Soviet Jewry, a mini course being given by one of our visiting scholars, Professor Jonathan Dekel-Chen, that starts February 3rd. We have a second mini course being given by our second visiting scholar, Dr. Greg Drinkwater, and that's called Jewish Countercultures, Remaking American Judaism, 1967 to 1990. So you already have some prep for that if you are on today's webinar. Two of my esteemed colleagues are giving book talks with respondents. Professor Paula Tartikoff will be discussing her new book, and the title of her talk is Conversion, Circumcision, and Ritual Murder, a Medieval Mystery Unraveled, and she'll be in conversation with medievalist David Shayevitz. And distinguished Professor Jeffrey Chandler will be in conversation with Professor Josh Lambert on Jeffrey's new book, Yiddish Biography of a Language. All of these are on the website. We have other things in planning, including the screening of a film, Queen of Hearts, about a feminist artist named Audrey Flack. So I welcome you to all of those events. And I want to give a final thank you to Karen Small, Managing Director of the Bildner Center, Sarah Portilla, Program Coordinator, Hannah Feldman, our Administrative Assistant, and Jenny Gurman, who's behind the scenes, without whom nothing would happen. So good night to everyone. Stay safe, be well. Kirsten, thank you so much. And I hope personally to see you as soon as possible.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you again to you, Nancy, to the whole audience. Thank you, everyone. It was a great experience. Thank you. And have a great night and stay safe.
Good night, everyone.